Let's talk about a couple of economic terms that I would love you to kind of relate and why they're important. The first one I think about is M2 money supply. And there's a lot of doomers talking about M2 money supply going negative. It hasn't gone negative since the Great Depression. They don't zoom out and realize what happened the last 2 years, but they just talk about it going negative the last, whatever it is, 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is. But let's talk about M2 money supply. Why should an average person care? What does it mean when doomers say it goes negative? And why may it not be, such a terrible thing in current
Yeah,
context?
well, I think, doomers going to doom. That's what they
Yeah,
do. They've been dooming
that's what
for
they
two
do.
years. They've been dooming for 2 years, and we're still here. So I think the common art, so M2 at a high level is basically deposits in a bank. It's what people think of as money. It's money supply. So the common argument, I think, is that, well, money supply is shrinking. That means that, maybe the economy might go into recession because there's less money to spend. I think that really fundamentally misunderstands the idea of money supply and also misunderstands what's happening on a macro level. Now, just a little bit of history. Now, the idea that money supply is a big factor into what happens in the economy is something that's intuitively very appealing, right? So Milton Friedman, who is a very famous economist, has a memorable quote, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And back in the 1980s, the Fed and many people in the economics establishment took this very seriously. So we had an inflation problem in the 1980s. And so the Fed was like, this must have something to do with money supply. So they began to track the money supply. And in fact, for a period of time, they implemented monetary policy by adjusting the supply of money rather than just purely interest rates. In fact, they tried to track money supply. They invented, M2, M3, M4, M5. And they did that for several years and realized that it was not working. That doesn't seem to be how the world works. It's a very appealing concept, but it's been tried for so many times to focus on money supply and link that to broader economic variables, and it just doesn't work. And I think I can explain in this context today why. So what is M2? M2 is basically a deposit, a bank deposit. So when you log into your checking account at the bank, you see that deposit that's counted in M2. Where does that deposit come from? It can actually be created in one of two ways. One, a deposit is created when a bank makes a loan. So this is something really interesting about banking is that when a bank goes and makes a loan, it's not lending you someone else's money. It's actually creating money out of thin air. Banks
Mhm.
create money. That's what they do. And usually, traditionally speaking, when we see, let's see, M2 money supply increasing, it's because banks are lending more. And you can make an argument that, if there's more lending activity, that's bullish for the economy. That's reasonable.
Mhm.
But that forgets that there is another person who can also create M2, and that's the central bank. So
Mhm.
when the Fed is doing quantitative easing, for example, they're buying tremendous amounts of treasury securities. Well, let's look at it from your perspective. I have a treasury security. Okay, it's sitting in my Schwab account, $100,000 in treasuries. I sell that to the Fed, and the Fed takes it and gives me $100,000 in deposits. So there's a few steps between this, but at the end of the day, that's what happens. And in fact, M2 increased not because of bank lending, but simply because of monetary policy. Now, over the past 2 years, M2 has increased significantly because the Fed has been buying a lot of assets. Now, if that's the case, we have to think about what does that mean economically? If I have $100,000 in treasuries and I sell that to the Fed, I have $100,000 in cash now, but I also have $100,000 less in US Treasury securities. Does that impact my behavior? I don't think it does because my purchasing power doesn't change. I still have the same amount of assets. It's just that, maybe instead of earning a few percent on my treasuries, maybe I
Right.
earn less on my deposits. Basically, that's going to shape my behavior. Maybe I go and I do investments or something like that, which is what the Fed wants you to do, but it
Right.
doesn't actually impact my overall purchasing power. So that was why M2 increased over the past 2 years. And now that M2 is decreasing, it's just the Fed doing quantitative tightening and reversing that whole process. So
Mhm.
now, instead of having $100,000 of deposits in my Schwab account, I swap that for treasuries.
Yep.
I don't think that actually impacts my purchasing power. So I don't really think it impacts my what I'm doing economically. So I think that to me that doesn't sound very alarming to see M2 drop, because it's dropping simply because of monetary policy.
But Joseph, it hasn't done it since the Great Depression. It has to be a problem. That's the story the doomers
Of
say.
course, but the Fed really hasn't shrank its balance sheet this aggressively ever. Again, so I think of it in terms of purchasing power. If we have less purchasing power in the economy, I think that's bad for the economy. But the thing is, because the decline in M2 doesn't necessarily track purchasing power anymore, whereas it's because you're basically swapping deposits for treasury securities. So I don't think that narrative makes sense. It could make sense in a world where you don't have the Fed doing anything, but that's not the world we live in.
Yeah, what I would ask folks when they think about M2 and they see these scary headlines, you don't even have to zoom out very far. Like zoom out to like 10,000 feet. M2 money supply was clearly on a trend for 100 years. Then we have this once in a lifetime, knock on wood, event. M2 skyrockets because we test the helicopter money scenario and we give everybody money, shoots up. Now, yes, we're going negative, but it's, we're sucking some of the, money out of the system. It's not like
it's still a huge increase, right?
Yeah, it's like massive. What are you guys doing?
So you basically went on Mount Everest, then you took a step back and you think that you're on the ground, but you're still quite high.
Yeah, you're still at, whatever it is, 15 or 18,000 foot. You're nowhere even close to being truly negative, but doomers got to doom, to your point.